Today, we're going to talk about a story that's incredibly tough to hear, but one that is absolutely essential to understanding American history. It's the story of how a mother's unbelievable courage in the face of the worst grief imaginable helped spark the civil rights movement. We're talking about the murder of Emmett Till, a tragedy that held up a mirror to America, forcing it to see a reality it could no longer pretend wasn't there.
Just let that sink in for a second. A 14-year-old kid was brutally murdered for supposedly whistling at a white woman. That single, simple sentence tells you everything you need to know about the world we're about to step into. Because in the summer of 1955, that one allegation set off a chain reaction that would absolutely horrify the nation. So, before he became this powerful symbol of injustice, Emmett Till was he was just a kid. So who was he really? And how did a teenager from Chicago end up in the deep, dangerous, and segregated world of the Jim Crow South?
He was from Chicago, a funny, confident kid who loved playing pranks. A friend of his said he just loved to make people laugh. He was just a boy full of life, heading down to Mississippi to visit family for the summer, probably expecting to have some fun.
And this is so important to understand. The Chicago Emmett knew and the Mississippi he was visiting were like two different countries. The Jim Crow South was built on this incredibly rigid and violent racial hierarchy. There were unspoken rules everywhere, demanding total submission from black people. And Emmett, coming from the North, he was just completely unprepared for this world. And that culture clash would prove to be absolutely fatal.
All right, let's get to the moment that changed everything. It started with something so innocent, a trip to a tiny grocery store to buy some bubblegum. But this simple act turned into a fateful and ultimately deadly encounter.
So just 3 days into his visit, Emmett and his cousins go into Brian's grocery. And the woman working there, Carolyn Bryan, later claimed that Emmett had whistled at her, grabbed her, and said obscene things. That's the story she told her husband, Roy Bryant.
But here's the devastating truth, the lie at the very heart of this tragedy. More than half a century later, Carolyn Bryant admitted it. She made it up. None of it was true. The entire story that led to a 14-year-old's murder was a complete fabrication.
4 days after that lie, Carolyn's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Malam, showed up at Emmett's great-uncle's house in the middle of the night and kidnapped him. What they did next is just monstrous. They beat him so badly they gouged out one of his eyes. Then they shot him in the head. And to make sure he was never found, they tied his body to a 75-pound cotton gin fan with barbed wire and threw him in the Tallahatchie River.
Now, what happened next could have just vanished into history, like so many other lynchings that went unpunished. But it didn't. And that is because of the profound, unbelievable courage of one person, Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley. When they finally found Emmett's body in the river, it was so horribly disfigured he was only identifiable because of a ring he was wearing. The authorities sent his body back to Chicago in a coffin that was literally nailed shut, but Mamie made a decision that would change the course of history. She demanded an open casket funeral. She said, "Let the world see what has happened, because there is no way I could describe this." And the world did see. 100,000. That's how many people came to Emmett's funeral in Chicago. 100,000 mourners filed past his open casket. I mean, to put that into perspective, if that had been an organized march, it would have been one of the largest civil rights demonstrations in American history up to that point. It was a massive, spontaneous outpouring of grief and outrage. And Mamie's brave decision created a ripple effect that just kept going. A major black publication, Jet Magazine, published the photos of her son's mutilated body. Those images were graphic, they were horrifying, and they were impossible to ignore. They forced people all over the country, black and white, to look at the real face of racism.
Well, all of this national pressure did lead to a trial for Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam. But let's be real, the trial was a complete sham from the get-go. The jury? All white, all male, because black people and women weren't allowed to serve. The courtroom was segregated, the sheriff was openly racist, there was just no way a fair trial was ever going to happen.
And get this, the defense attorney's closing argument basically ignored the evidence. Instead, it was this shameless, direct appeal to white supremacy. He was literally telling the jury to acquit the men because they were all white.
And of course it worked. The jury was out for just 66 minutes, a little over an hour, and then they came back with a verdict, not guilty. A juror later said, and this is just chilling, "We wouldn't have taken so long if we hadn't stopped to drink pop." The lack of even the pretense of justice it's just staggering.
The verdict was an absolute travesty, but it wasn't the end of the story. In fact, you could argue this is where the real story begins. This spectacular failure of justice is exactly what turned Emmett Till's murder into such a powerful catalyst for change.
So just a few months after they were acquitted, Bryant and Millam, protected by double jeopardy laws, which means you can't be tried for the same crime twice, they sold their story to a magazine. And they confessed. They admitted to the entire country, in full detail, that they had kidnapped and murdered Emmett Till. And they were never, ever punished for it.
And that brazen injustice, it lit a fire. For so many people who had become leaders and foot soldiers in the civil rights movement, this was the final straw. Just a few months after the trial, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery, she later explained that in that moment, she said, "I thought about Emmett Till, and I couldn't go back. It was a direct inspiration."
And that's really the legacy, isn't it? His mother, Mamie, said his death made people realize that things this horrible could take place. It wasn't just an abstract idea of racism anymore. It was the brutalized face of a 14-year-old boy, and it forced a nation to finally wake up to a nightmare that had been happening for far too long.
So it all leaves us with a really important question to think about. What if Mamie hadn't made that choice? What if those photos had never been published in Jet magazine? Without that media coverage, how different would this story be? It's a powerful reminder of how bearing witness, through images and through stories, can actually demand change.